Despite its lukewarm reception when it launched over a year ago, Jump Force is a game that has had a surprising amount of longevity. Compared to the reaction it had at launch, I was shocked to see that it was successful enough to warrant a second season of DLC, and that it still has a relatively dedicated community. Now that the game has finally made its way to Switch, I've seen enough people online asking if it's any good, to where I thought that it'd warrant a video. You could consider this a review, although I wanted to focus on the state of the game after its first season of content, including all the DLC characters, since that's what the Switch version includes. I'll also be breaking this down into sections with timestamps in the description. When it comes to licensed games, I feel like character is what people care about more than anything. People will forgive a lot about a game if it has a ton of characters to play as, and if you look at the top comments on any upcoming anime licensed game, it'll mostly just be people asking why X character hasn't been announced yet. Now, I sympathize with the fact that creating a roster for a game meant to represent the entire history of Shonen Jump is an impossible task, so rather than nitpicking over which series were or weren't featured, I wanted to evaluate the characters that were picked for the biggest series of the game. This is definitely going to be the longest section, so I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible so this video doesn't turn into a 30-minute rant about why my favorite characters weren't included. I wanted to mainly look at the core series that needed to be included and evaluate the character choice based on that. Obviously the big three, Naruto, One Piece, and Dragon Ball, have the most representation in the base game. Because the developers had to limit the number of characters from each series, most of these characters ended up feeling pretty safe, but there were some questionable choices that made me scratch my head. Naruto, I feel like of the big three, has the most lackluster character picks. Now Naruto, Sasuke, and Kakashi are all really solid, obvious must-haves, and Gaara was a nice choice for a character that's a little unique and out there. What I really didn't like is having Kaguya representing the villain of the series. I get that she's the ultimate villain, and a lot of the evil character picks ended up being the ultimate villain of the series, but for only appearing in one volume of the manga, I don't know anyone who would have been excited about playing as her compared to someone like Orochimaru or Pain. It also sucks that Boruto is lumped in with the Naruto cast, because while I get that many view Boruto as part of the current generation of Shonen Jump, I don't think he has the same appeal as a character like Rock Lee or Neji does. One Piece also has some really questionable choices. I don't know if Spike included Sabo over Ace because they wanted to stay as canon as possible, but I can guarantee would have been a way more exciting pick. Blackbeard also seems like he was just picked because he's what you could consider the ultimate villain in One Piece, but compared to someone like Doflamingo or Crocodile, who've had way more screen time, playing as him isn't exciting, especially when so much about Blackbeard is still shrouded in mystery in the manga. And with Dragon Ball, there's really not much to say. I would have liked to see Piccolo or Cell swapped for a more unique and fun character like Teen Gohan or Beerus. I don't think anyone would have minded throwing in a non-canon character like Broly either, if it meant the cast would feel a little less stale. There are no out there character picks that get hype over, although the inclusion of Super Saiyan Blue as a transformation was a nice touch. Finally, one thing I thought was really odd about the base game is the lack of My Hero Academia characters. I'm not the biggest fan of the series, but it feels weird to only include the main characters of a series that is totally dominating the anime and manga space right now. Switch purchasers will be able to use All Might and Bakugo, but it's frustrating that neither of them could have been included day one. Now, while what I've said so far about the characters has been mostly negative, I wanted to give credit for a few inclusions that I think were really great. Yugi was a really weird, awesome addition for a fighting game. Ryo Seiba was an obscure character, at least to American audiences, and it was really cool to just be able to play as a guy with a gun. Finally, Kenshiro was a nice way to include a badass classic character from Jump's history. When it comes to the DLC characters, they helped round out the roster significantly. Bandai Namco really knew which characters to withhold, and while it's easy to accuse them of cutting popular characters to sell more season passes, I think there's a distinction between withholding content and trying to create an attractive season pass to support the game post-launch. In that sense, I think Seto Kaiba is a perfect DLC character. He's hype as hell, and I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Is represented enough in the base game with just Yugi. While Madara is another character who I wish would have been in the base game, I understand why they would have wanted to save him for a DLC character. Without going into too much more detail, I think overall most of the DLC characters are good choices. I'm glad that they're included in Jump Force's Switch version. While it's easy to go on about who should or shouldn't have been added, it's clear that the roster decisions were made according to some weird criteria. It seems like Spike included the characters they had to include over which characters people wanted included. Choices seem to be made based on weird requirements like who's the main villain instead of who's the most iconic villain or who would people want to play as. Limiting Light to a story-only character was also a really lame letdown. His inclusion at the end of the announcement trailer felt like a signal that the character roster was going to be really creative, so to see him limited to story mode felt like a cop-out. All in all, I wish Jump Force would have gotten a little more weird and out there with their selection, but the roster is okay. The character variety is not terrible, and all of the must-have boxes are checked. This is another element of the game that is pretty important. The whole premise of the game is that the Jump World collides with Earth, and you have to team up with the characters to save the universe. The way I see it, you can either create your own anime OC, or just pretend like it's really just you fighting in the game. Either way, I don't think the game gives you enough options to fulfill either fantasy. At first, it seems like these are cool homages until you realize that if you do use them, you just end up looking like a bootleg version of that character. Like, I have no idea how anyone would use a complete, uncustomizable Dio costume when Dio is already in the game. The next logical step would be to create some of the characters who aren't in the game yourself, but Jump Force is needlessly restrictive with its customization options. Only a select number of moves are able to be used on custom characters. Some moves I understand, like it would be really weird to see Star Platinum being summoned by a random character, but there are so many characters who could have been recreated with, for example, Ryo Seba's gun-based abilities, and I have no idea why Namco Bandai is so stingy with what moves you can and can't use. There are also no usable weapons. I get that it may have become complicated to include a bunch of weapon styles, but it looks pretty dumb to summon an energy sword to attack someone when you already have a real sword on your back. It's needlessly restrictive, and a custom character creator in a multiversal manga fighting game sounds way better on paper than it is in practice. This is probably where the most potential for Jump Force is lost. The concept of the Jump World colliding with the real world offers so many opportunities for cool story moments, but the game does absolutely nothing creative. All of these diverse characters interacting with one another, and there's hardly any kind of clever banter. Sometimes you don't even remember the Jump characters were brought into the real world because besides from the stages being famous cities from around the world, it plays no factor in the characters' discussions. I honestly feel like there must have been major rewrites for the game's story, where the team was just given no time to flesh it out, because there are hours of this game where literally nothing happens. You're either fighting nameless troops, or you're fighting a major manga villain, you defeat them, and then they fly away, or it's revealed that they weren't the real villain all along. Like this mission where you have to fight 3 Friezas is so unimaginably lame, and story mode is filled with meaningless encounters just like this. Another reason I feel the story had no time to be developed is because the DLC missions are honestly pretty creative, at least compared to the vanilla missions you're sent on. It feels fun to go on missions to recruit Toshiro or Grimmjow, and the dialogue feels like time was spent writing it specific to the character. Admittedly, it is cool to hear characters from different manga mention each other in what I believe is their original anime voices.
Luffy, 話は聞いたぞ。サンジのやつが敵を手引きしたそうだな。
Although it's a shame the majority of dialogue isn't voiced, and some characters just aren't voiced at all.
回収したコズミックキューブを一時的に保管している倉庫だ。なんてことだ。まさか彼が。
The story mode doesn't just pad its length. Most of its length is padding. At least for me, there are a few things more frustrating in a game than when I feel like it's intentionally wasting my time. I don't think that people ask for much when it comes to gameplay in licensed anime fighting games. Most aren't designed to be deep, rich, competitive games that are meant to be poured over. They're usually pretty utilitarian, but Jump Force just feels really flat and boring. Characters share so many properties that every character feels virtually the same, minus their special moves. Sometimes it's hard to even tell what's going on, and I just hit the combination of buttons that led to a combo in the last fight. Special moves have really odd startup, and there's no feedback that makes landing a special move feel satisfying. Most attacks even slow the game down, and the frame rate regularly plummets. The whole game feels like you're fighting on the moon, and combat just feels really passive. The decision to have a shared health bar is also baffling to me. The game does let you summon assist and change characters, only in a specific order for some reason, but there's an interesting dynamic to assist calls. Assists have to be protected, they can even be hit by your opponent's ultimate abilities. This is where a tag system, akin to Marvel vs. Capcom 3, would have worked much better. Having shared health also kills the feeling that you're fighting alongside your favorite characters, because since every character shares the same pool of health, you don't feel like your teammates are individuals, if that makes sense. There's not really a strategic reason to tag in a new character unless you're just extending a combo. There's also this weird, obtuse RPG element to story mode, where characters have different attack types and carry XP. I felt zero compulsion to dive into this part of the game, and it just feels like a needless way to add meaningless depth. If you connect online, you can see other players' characters and have minimal interaction with them. I don't know why, but this has become a trend in Japanese fighting games this generation, and I feel like it's one of the most useless features to include. I don't feel a connection to any other players in my lobby, and having to walk over to the station to play a versus match sounds like a minor annoyance, but it's just another obstacle to playing what I want. It makes me feel like playing a casual local match with my friends would be too much hassle. While I know I'm in the minority, the art style is where I really like what Jump Force did. Yes, sometimes it's off-putting to see the characters as fleshy, but given their manga characters invading the real world, it would make sense for them to look jarring. I particularly like how Frieza looks smooth and polished, and how Madara's skin, unlike most of his incarnations, appropriately makes him look like a zombie. Some of the stage backgrounds are also visually interesting. Seeing the final valley rising next to the Golden Gate Bridge is a really cool sight, but I just wish they did more with that concept in the story. On my Xbox One X, the game looks pretty good, although there are frame rate issues in offline single player, as I mentioned, where you can tell the game is poorly optimized. The game just feels rough. If you look at any gameplay clip of Jump Force, you can see how almost any special move causes the game to slow down. As for the cutscenes in story mode, they just feel barren, much like the story itself. There are hardly any sound effects, and it doesn't seem like anything was animated unless it absolutely had to be. The whole thing just feels cheap, again pointing to how rushed the game felt. Jump Force is going to have a confusing legacy. I feel like it's a game most people shit on, yet it's successful by several metrics. It was the 4th best-selling game of 2019 in North America, which surprised me, and was nominated for Fighting Game of the Year at the Game Awards. It's not a game that I'd recommend, but the novelty of combining all these iconic characters is enough that I'd encourage those curious to at least give it a try. That being said, given how flat the game feels and how cumbersome it is to simply play a match, I don't think I would ever sit on the couch with my friends, have a beer, bullshit, and play Jump Force, which could be the most damning mark I could make against the game. If you find the game on sale, I think it's worth checking out if you're curious, but I would just keep your expectations very, very low.